Thank you for watching. My name's Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Govern. So today I wanted to just talk a little bit about our Washington State Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reykdal here, and his musings about public education and the clear train wreck that he has left behind at pretty much everywhere he's gone when it comes to public education in Washington State. And I think it just merits, I read a couple articles recently, kind of inspired me to get involved and look at this issue again. Of course, I've done a few different articles about him. One of the people I've run into recently, they were speculating that maybe one of Chris Reykdal's theories, because he's a very hyper-partisan and aggressive leftist in that position and supports the Democrat Party pretty strongly, is maybe why he's trashing public education so thoroughly in Washington State, is that his theory is that if the graduating students can't understand math and they can't read, maybe just then he can convince them to vote Democrat. But I'm not sure that's the reason. Let's dig into some of the issues that we're facing in Washington State and our public education system today. But before we do, I just want to remind you that if you haven't hit the subscribe or like button down below, please do so. And also feel free to share this video with others who might also be concerned with the downward spiral that Washington State's public education system currently finds itself in. Now, of course, leadership starts at the top, and when we talk about Chris Reykdal, and it is pronounced Reykdal, not Reykdal, even though that's oftentimes the way people refer to him, he has been on a tirade, just like other incompetent politicians, where they're only obsessed about Trump and want to distract from their own incompetence in their own political position here. One of the things is, of course, that Trump and Reykdal's basically been threatening and attacking Trump all the time, saying that he's this authoritarian. But of course, it's Chris Reykdal who operates exactly that way, threatening to, and successfully helping to fire many teachers for daring to not wear masks or not get the jab. Reykdal's the one who's threatened more school districts with taking away their funding, which is entirely an unconstitutional effort on his part, because they aren't doing what he wants them to do, not because they're not doing a good job teaching students. Of course, that's not a problem for Reykdal, but primarily and only because he wants them to take the jab, take the vaccines, keep their school closed, or in this case, maybe hurt girls in sports by making sure that the boys get to beat up on them in the athletic endeavors. This has just been the way he's been rolling lately, and it's so weird to see him pretending that he cares about Trump being authoritarian when the most authoritarian and abusive guy who's ever held the role of superintendent of public instruction, Chris Reykdal, has been doing the same thing that he accuses others of doing, and far worse. Now, one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that there is a lot of nepotism that goes on in Washington State government. We see it all the time, and Chris Reykdal is kind of a poster child for this. He obviously had hired his wife. Well, he worked at OSPI just to ensure that they had high six-figure incomes and might as well bring it all under one house. And of course, at the same time, he's out there firing whistleblowers. Now, how would I know that he's hired his spouse? Well, because even his own financial record documents here, his F1 clearly shows that he's hired and she works for him at OSPI. That's nice when it comes to commuting to work. You got to both take the same car, and but you also happen to make a lot of money ensuring that you've done all the damage that you possibly can to public education in Washington State. Now, when I talk about the whistleblowers, I'm talking about last month there was a lawsuit filed against Chris Reykdal and OSPI because anytime anybody on a school board anywhere decides, or within the OSPI administration, decides to take a stance that's at all slightly divergent from the orthodoxy that Reykdal's pitching that given day, then he goes in and fires him. And that history that he has of being abusive to staff and threatening them and removing them and purging the administration, despite the fact that that's probably something he claims is evil and terrible when other people do it, he does it all the time. And these lawsuits that are in play right now are examples of that type of behavior on his part. Now, one of the things I've talked about with previous videos, as we've discussed kind of just the disaster of public education that Reykdal has turned our state into, is that he's kind of created this temple of education doom. And he certainly wants you to take your kids and sacrifice them on the altar of his experiments in public education. But let's get into some of the details and let's talk about this. Some of the accomplishments that Reykdal's had since he's been in office, and he was elected in 2016, but since he's been in office, we've had the steepest collapse of student enrollment in Washington State public education. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this in the history of the state. Now, part of it was related to COVID, but part of that was related to how Reykdal decided to abuse students and expose the parents to the bad and crazy curriculum that he had been pushing on the public education system. And so, not surprisingly, a large number, close to 42,000 total, parents pulled their kids out of the school system and then put them elsewhere. And one of the things that I should point out here is that this was a huge increase in homeschooling. Reykdal has actually become the poster child for homeschooling in Washington State, and he's also helped inspire a substantial increase in private school education. Because not everybody's pulling their kids out of public school just because they don't like having their girls beat up by boys in sports, or just because of crazy DEI policies. Some of them are just simply pulling them out and sending them to private schools because they actually want their kids to learn how to read or achieve higher success and higher skills. In fact, when we look at the percentage of parents that have pulled their kids out in wealthier school districts where they can afford to send their kids to private education or get private tutors, we see it to be quite high in places like Mercer Island or Issaquah and Bellevue and other places. And this is a direct result of the very terrible leadership that Chris Reykdal has exhibited since he's been in charge of OSPI. On top of that, the claim that's endless that they don't have enough money is just a false lie. The Washington State legislature and under Reykdal's tenure there, the budget has increased consistently by billions and billions of dollars every single school year. And it's increased in every measurable way, whether you adjust for inflation, just the raw numbers, every amount. They have sent more and more money to go down the public education system, and the results, you're not seeing an improvement that comes along with all that money. However, what you do see is on the West Coast of the United States, Washington State spends more money than any other state in the Western United States on our education system. And so there's no doubt that we have no shortage of funds going to public education. And this is even, again, organized by a per student basis. We are getting close to being over $20,000 per student, which is almost twice what Idaho spends. It's it's even more than what California spends per student in their system. And that's, so if you're going to measure success by grabbing more taxpayer dollars, then that's been a successful effort on Reykdal's part. However, unfortunately, by every academic measurement that you have, the more money has not produced better results. In fact, in Washington State, has produced worse results in almost every measurement. Math, English, everything has gone down. The more money that Washington State spent, the worse the educational outcomes have been by any type of test measurement standards. And this is true even when they've dumbed down the tests and watered down the results and tried to find ways of gaming to make it look a lot better than it actually is. That being said, Washington State is not last place in everything. We actually are second highest in America compared to all 50 states for starting teacher salary. And we're actually the fourth highest in America for the average teacher salary. So the one thing that has happened is we do pay our teachers more than almost any other state in America. But unfortunately, we also are at 48th place when it comes to kids being able to go to college, and one of the worst in America when it comes to graduation dropout rates, and also very poorly when it comes to how they do on SAT scores and standardized tests like that. So Washington State, assuming that the goal of the education system here is to actually teach kids to be able to read and write and perhaps maybe commit an accidental act of math occasionally, instead what we're doing is ensuring that their skills in these areas are dropping by the year almost consistently. And this is a big problem. Now, on top of all of this issue, the school systems across Washington State, and we have, 295 school districts, these school districts are not doing well financially. despite the massive increase in funding. There's about 10% of the school districts across Washington state now that are either essentially they've gone under financially and the state is having to intervene and financially take them over, or they're getting close to being there. Marysville School District from last year, this story came out. This was one of the, basically the canary in the gold mine, only it's not much of a gold mine, maybe it's a coal mine at this point in time. That canary has completely suffocated out of their own predictable financial mismanagement. I'm going to point out something. Marysville 10 years ago was one of the #1 school districts when I worked at the Freedom Foundation. I guess it's a little longer than that ago now. It's about 12 years ago that when we had analyzed the teacher contracts and the pay contracts, we could predict that the school district was going to be in financial distress shortly, just based on how they bloated the reward system there and how there was just zero accountability. And of course, inevitably, that's what happened. But Marysville's not alone. You had apparently too much Common Core math in the administration out of the Moses Lake School District, where an $11 million accounting error really ultimately led to a $20 million shortfall, and of course, laying off over 100 employees out there. I mean, just another disaster. Now, this could be that because you had a lot of public school grads who went into the administration in Moses Lake, that could be why their math was that bad. But at the end of the day, it's a problem, and the district is essentially in also financial distress. And it's not surprising Moses Lake had these problems. I did this article a few years ago where we had caught the superintendent out there actually stealing money from the school district. So yeah, it's, when you have people like this in charge, what do you think is going to happen in that school? It's not like anybody's clearly paying attention to financial management when you're stealing some of the money for yourself. So that's unfortunately one of the problems. But it's not just these kind of satellite school districts. When you go right into the heart of the wealthiest part of Washington state, which is in the Bellevue School District area, as an example, just a few years ago, it was considered one of the best school districts in the state of Washington. And it was a magnet for having people come in to live in that area. And even a school district like this is now in financial distress, needing the state to come in and have oversight of their finances. Now, to their credit, at least, they did fire their finance director there. And part of the reason why they got into this financial distress was as they had an exodus of students leaving the school district, they did not adjust their budget accordingly. And on top of that, they got COVID money, just like most of the school districts did. And many of the school districts that are in trouble got these one-time COVID funds, which essentially were squandered and wasted on continual costs, on regular recurring costs instead of just one-time solutions. They were built into the budget and baked in the cake with the presumption that somehow COVID was going to last forever. And when you wonder why there was such a push to keep some of these lockdown policies going, it was, in some cases, entities like this that they needed that extra bonus cash to justify getting more and more of it all the time, regardless of outcomes. They didn't care about that. They just wanted the money to come in, and they budgeted that poorly moving forward, that now you had this huge shortfall, and now they're laying off teachers and cutting programs when they can least expect it or least benefit from it, because what they're trying to do is encourage more of those students who have left to actually come back, and you're not going to do it when you have headlines like this. Now, at the same time, Reykdal has a well-known history, as the Seattle Times article here from just 2 years ago talks about, is that cheerleading mediocrity and giving high fives to kids in the slow lane and discouraging any kind of highly capable programs and any kind of educational programs that would actually perhaps teach kids to read and do math better and actually just do anything well, instead always celebrate failure and mediocrity. That's been his hallmark as OSPI director and superintendent. And that's a big problem in Washington state, because if what you're trying to do is shove educational development down lower and lower with lower expectations, dumbing down everything, taking away any kind of standardized testing or fighting against it anyway, and all you care about is just getting more and more cash to squander and spend as poorly as it's been spent, well, then you're not going to have great outcomes, and this is one of the problems. Now, Reykdal, perhaps he's not the only one, but he's been heavily involved in fanning the flames of the fire that he started in Washington State's public education system. And the bigger question isn't so much whether there's a problem, because it's impossible to deny that it's a complete mess. And even though we have people who are nominally in charge, it's very clear that those people don't know what they're doing. They don't care about the disaster they've created. And in fact, they're just simply going to leave it to other people to clean up their mess. And that's why we have Reykdal here right now. So one of the questions is, how do we fix the destruction, the damage that a guy like this has done? I think one of the initial key requirements has to be, in public education generally, is that you're going to need to restore that grit and resilience and higher standards, maybe standards higher than you've ever had before, to encourage people to actually start sending their kids there. The last thing they're going to want to do is go to a continuously dumbing down, low expectations, no discipline, and no concern over, and where everybody's a winner no matter how bad they're doing. That's not really an inspirational education system that most people, most parents would actually want to send their kids to, even parents in Seattle. Secondly, it's very clear that we have to cut the pay, especially for the higher levels of administration all throughout the public education system in Washington State. Despite the greatly increased pay for higher administrators, the superintendents, OSPI employees, especially at the upper levels, Chris Reykdal's salary for sure, his wife's salary, but any of these upper level management payroll, it's gotten to the point where many superintendents in Washington State are making north of $400,000 a year. And for what? Failing in every measurable way in their school system. And we just keep bloating this administrative element of education with zero return in value to the outcomes that we're hoping to get in public education. So cutting and slashing, I think, the administrative costs of public education, from OSPI offices and in Olympia, all the way down to the superintendent positions. There was recently a proposal in the legislature that the Democrats all voted against, and the Republicans, as a distinction, clearly voted in favor of, which was to cap the pay for superintendents in Washington State schools. And this came out of a number of scandals recently where superintendents came out and were fired or let go, and the school districts had to pay $400,000 or more as just as a separation fee. It's for these super expensive, very highly compensated people, despite the fact that they were failing in every measurable way. And so the Republicans have proposed an amendment that said, listen, we want to cap their pay at $250,000. And the Democrats said, absolutely no way. They would prefer to have highly paid, super incompetent administrators in the education system rather than cut their pay. And unfortunately, this is one of those things that I think we have no choice but to step in and intervene at some point in time. If we're going to have public education administrators, they need to be earning their pay, not just get it for showing up and failing all the time. And remember, this also, I think, it ties into a couple other things where, particularly when we see these financial collapses of over 10% of the school districts in Washington State, directly as a result of fiscal mismanagement at a scale that's very difficult. We need to actually, difficult to imagine, but we need to institute some kind of personal financial penalties for upper management that's in charge when budgets are clearly going downhill like this. The complete lack of discipline or concern or even attention that's given to those failing budgets is a significant issue. And when you have an $11 million accounting error, like they claim in Moses Lake, then that should be doubly significant in places like that. I don't know what that would be, but we have to have some kind of, I think, personal financial penalty for those people. And that includes at the Chris Reykdal level, all the way up to OSPI. If nobody's going to hold anyone accountable, then there needs to be some penalties when those inevitably problematic situations occur. And this one is maybe not necessarily as obvious, but I would advocate that the OSPI and the state should no longer be involved in, on a monthly basis, taking that money out of teacher paychecks to fund the Washington Education Association. The WEA has been a cheerleader for every element of destroying public education in Washington State for many decades now. They care not at all whether they want to make sure every student's a winner. They want to make sure that standards are dumbed down. They want to make sure that accountability is absent. They want to make sure that they get lots of money, no accountability, and terrible outcomes. And that's what we're rewarding the Washington education system with. And that Washington Education Association, one of the problems is they have the largest PAC, they have the largest amount of money that they throw into the election process to get people like Reykdal elected. If it were not for them, Reykdal would not be elected. But they're the ones that marshal all the funds, spend all the money, and that's money that's being taken on a monthly basis out of teacher paychecks. And instead, I think they need to set up an organization where they have to encourage teachers to pay them, not have it automatically taken. It needs to be on a billing system instead of this auto removal. Essentially, it'll give every teacher a $1,000 pay raise. The WEA will have to try to justify their existence, and they'll be less of a financial powerhouse, destroying the future of kids in Washington state and corrupting the political process moving forward. Now, it's just not all the solutions that exist out there, but in the end, we have to try to do something to make an impact and to change the way the public education system's going. Now, listen, the truth is Reykdal's done more to encourage homeschooling in Washington state and private schooling than anybody else ever has in education in state history. And there's some arguments, I realize, for people who support homeschooling and private schooling, which I do, but for people who generally support it, they've advocated that keeping Reykdal in there as such a train wreck as he destroys public education is a good way to promote those systems. And there's probably some political truth to that, but I don't think that that's honestly a good way to run the public education system. The reality is we're going to have a public education system of some kind in our state moving forward. And we have to encourage, I think, a better choice, having the money follow the kids, help people be able to get out of a failing education system. And Reykdal may be in charge of that failing education system right now, but eventually he goes away and somebody else takes over. We have to find solutions to a public education system that's a complete disaster like the one that he has managed to trash in his tenure. But it takes work, it takes effort. It's not an easy solution, it's not an easy fix. Finding alternatives to education, finding solutions that may work for some students, and then finding other solutions for others. I think that there's a lot of, it's more of a kaleidoscope of options that we have. There's not one magic solution, but we can guarantee that when we keep horrific and terrible people in public education in Washington state, put them in charge, pay them high six-figure salaries, and then watch them sacrifice generations of children to their educational disasters and fiascos of administrative incompetence, then we know that there's going to be problems, and we have to stop that process as much as we can. We do have to replace the worst people that we put into public office. Chris Reykdal is a good candidate for one of those people that just absolutely has to be replaced. But with that, the only way you do it is if you're willing to pay attention and show up and let everybody around you know what's going on. And that takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy, and it does require us to show up and let everybody know just what kind of incompetence and clown show that we have running public education in Washington state. It requires you and I and others to show up, because the only way you change things is if you're willing to show up, because the future belongs to those who show up.